Confused about the Venezuela intervention, the mixed signals, the contradictory explanations. Let's cut the noise, look at its underlying motives and what they foreshadow for the rest of the world. Venezuela has given Trump a chance to look presidential just when his approval ratings were reaching basement levels and the midterm campaign was shaping up to be about economic pain. Eliminating a bad guy who conveniently embodies both drugs and migration issues was a PR gift, were it not unilateral and a violation of US checks and balances. But who cares? It was spectacular. So let's rejoice instead of fixating on the small details. Naturally, the rest of the world will feel the consequences. And that's what we're looking at today. What happens next beyond the US. But first, just a brief reminder of Venezuela's history and, more importantly, its geopolitical alliances. In 1970, Venezuela was South America's richest country. Even in 1991, when Poland was just emerging from communism, Venezuela's GDP per capita was still 87% higher. That changed in 1999 with Hugo Chavez, whose attempts to introduce Cuban-style socialism had, well, the typical consequences of authoritarian socialism. Within years, the economy was in freefall. After his death, Nicolás Maduro took over just in time to see oil prices plummet, driving the country to near collapse and forcing almost 8 million people to flee. Venezuela now has one of the world's highest homicide rates and serves as a hub for drugs, money laundering, human trafficking and organized crime. Politically isolated, it survives thanks to transnational crime syndicates and the help of friendly partners like Russia, China and Iran. All of this reads like an aberration given Venezuela's vast natural wealth and strategic location. But those are the same reasons why so many helpful friends have entrenched their influence there. The country essentially runs on an arrangement between the government and the army, as well as gangs and paramilitary groups, whose loyalties are bought with free access to illegal trafficking. Everyone gets rich, except ordinary Venezuelans. And in case you missed the viral Jack Ryan clip where he lays out why Venezuela matters geopolitically and then later snatches its dictator to bring him to justice, here's an only slightly less muscular and eloquent gentleman who will break down the reasons behind this intervention.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure.
So, aside from oil companies apparently not knowing about it, projections suggest that restoring Venezuela's energy sector would demand enormous capital, tens of billions of dollars, just over the next decade. Risk-averse US oil companies would also need functioning infrastructure, skilled workers, basic security, and you'd have to formalize corruption, pay off guerrillas, army factions, and criminals with oil profits so they wouldn't stage coups, fuel insurgencies, or sabotage the whole thing. Which is probably why Secretary of State Marco Rubio was at pains to explain how the US would run Venezuela without resorting to invasion/nation building. This is what he said to ABC News.
We are running is the direction that this is going to move moving forward. And that is, we have leverage. This leverage we are using and we intend to use. We started using already.
That's because the US's primary motive is less about profits than asserting control, which makes lots of sense, even if it's not as optimized for prime time as we'll take their oil and gold and send back those refugees. Trump has made it clear he wants Venezuela's new regime to kick out China, Russia and Iran before it can pump more oil, and then it should only partner with the US. Indeed, China and Iran have poured money into Venezuela's oil sector, and Russia has been the main enabler of its exports. The US is taking this control seriously enough to chase down a Russian shadow tanker that evaded the blockade. Russia even responded by sending a submarine and at least one naval vessel to escort it, while US forces stalked it across the Atlantic and seized it. Before we get too excited about this escalation, this is likely just another bargaining chip, not Trump suddenly cracking down on Russia's shadow fleet. Most people don't realize he never imposed full or secondary sanctions on Moscow. A related Senate bill by Lindsey Graham has been sitting on his desk for over a year. Trump apparently just gave it the green light. But this isn't the first time Senator Lindsey Graham is overly optimistic about this bill moving forward. Which brings us to the reasons behind the reasons. They don't look great for Russia or China, but also, unfortunately, for Europe. So, first of all, it's a show of force aimed at anyone, but specifically at Latin America. The broader message is that getting too cozy with China has become risky. A high-level Chinese delegation was in Caracas talking to Maduro just hours before US airstrikes. Venezuela's closest allies, Nicaragua, Colombia and Cuba, have most reasons to worry. Cuba will be deprived of its last economic lifeline in the form of cheap oil. Choking the already weakened Cuban economy is one of the US administration's stated goals. If Cuba falls, then Russia loses another important ally. Russian intelligence has a long history of local operations, from the Bay of Pigs to the Havana Syndrome weapon, tested in Cuba but engineered in Moscow. Not to mention that Chinese and Russian firms have joint ventures with Venezuela's oil monopoly, and both have extended billions of dollars in loans to the Maduro regime, which they're unlikely to recover. Venezuela has also been a close ally of Iran, with extensive economic and defense cooperation. It holds billions in Iranian investments, particularly from Revolutionary Guard-affiliated entities. And conveniently, that's another regime whose collapse the US is clearly working on, from Operation Midnight Hammer to tighter sanctions, and maybe even a deal with Saudi Arabia to keep oil prices low.
The simultaneous collapse of a strategic alliance in Latin America with the intensification of unrest inside Iran cannot be considered accidental from the perspective of both domestic and foreign observers.
Considering all this, it's eerie how quiet Russia and China have been. Analysts say this shows the so-called axis of authoritarians looks strong in peacetime, but isn't reliable when things go south. This, too, is a symbolic win for Trump, though it's hard to give him the moral high ground considering his own sketchy treatment of allies. Which brings us to the scary implications of this intervention, especially upon reading closely the US national security strategy published last month. It aligns with what Trump has dubbed the Donro doctrine, a new take on the Monroe Doctrine, asserting that the world is divided into spheres of influence, with the US controlling the Western Hemisphere while leaving other regions to rival powers. This could mean that Trump's next move would involve big trade-offs with China and Russia or Europe. Back in 2019, Trump's former advisor Fiona Hill testified that Putin informally signaled he might let the US have free rein in Venezuela if Washington left him unchallenged in Ukraine. Hill said the Trump-Putin deal hinged on the US pursuing the Monroe Doctrine. As former US envoy to Ukraine Kurt Volker summed it up for Times Radio,
well, this is something that Vladimir Putin's going to look at and say, yep, you can have Western Hemisphere. I'll take Eastern Europe. And we don't know how the Trump administration is going to feel about that.
Meanwhile, Chinese online activists are urging their government to emulate the US against Taiwan. You could easily imagine a random indictment of a Taiwanese leader paving the way for a blockade or a tighter chokehold. So the Chinese and the Russians are certainly unhappy about Venezuela, but especially in the case of China, this will only represent a short-term setback. Though Moscow has blasted US actions as neo-colonial, and Beijing has called them hegemonic, indeed, everyone can be an out-of-the-closet imperialist, projecting power with elbows or tanks into what each considers its own sphere, and profess judgments upon foreign leaders with the intention of taking them out. A less abductive or murderous, but still scary adaptation of this US strategy is already playing out in Western Europe, which I guess is the US's rightful sphere of influence. This is where actual regime change in favor of the far right is not just discreetly enacted, but explicitly laid out in that recent strategy paper. Europe is presented as an obstruction to American influence and even an enemy who has betrayed the US with the help of globalist elites. Interestingly, US electoral goals in Europe overlap with Russian and Chinese meddling, which tends to back hard-right candidates, usually more supportive of Beijing or the Kremlin's interests. Which is why grandstanding about Trump's emboldening dictators feels naive at this stage, especially considering one of his first moves after Venezuela was threatening to take Greenland and suggesting military force is always an option. In response, a joint warning from European NATO members stated that such takeover would destroy the alliance. You can see how this starts to look like a racket. I'll provide security in Europe, but I expect a gift. It has the word green in it. Otherwise, military force. Or I'll just dismantle NATO as a favor to my friends Vladimir and Xi, so they won't meddle in my other interests. Either way, it's all very Donro. For Trump, Ukraine appears to lie in Russia's sphere. But what will the US do about the Baltics? Because in Putin's grand vision, confirmed by recent US intelligence reports, he lays claim to parts of the former Soviet empire that include NATO members. And where exactly does that put Poland and other former Warsaw Pact states? Whose piece of the pie are we sitting on? As much as I welcome the US cracking down on Chinese, Russian and Iranian networks and admit a bit of schadenfreude as seeing regimes like Maduro's shaken down, I fear the hubris in an already ego-inflated administration could be the real danger. Maduro's snatch and grab looks impressive, but it's the sequel that will determine the operation's real success. If it leaves chaos in its wake, the Donro doctrine will be synonymous with overconfident failure. And while we wait for an epilogue, we are contemplating not only the intimidation of European allies and the erosion of long-standing, mutually beneficial security frameworks, but potentially the selling of some of us back to Russia or China. You'd be forgiven for not knowing how to call the Gulf of Mexico or confusing Greenland with Alaska or possibly the US's 51st state, which is Canada, obviously. Right, enough nonsense. Let's see how others get bogged down by geographic traps.
You should make an apology here to us. Because you didn't congratulate us for the peace deal that President Trump made between Albania and Venezuela.
If you're wondering what the Prime Minister of Albania meant by this...
To think that we settled Azerbaijan and Albania as an example, it was going on for years.
While Azerbaijan has indeed been at war with Armenia, Albania has not. Geography hasn't always been Trump's strongest suit.
So Belgium is a beautiful city.
Not even Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán could evade Trump's confident cartographical brushstroke.
Viktor Orban, did anyone ever hear of him? He's probably like one of the strongest leaders anywhere in the world. And he's the leader of, right? He's the leader of Turkey, fronts on both Russia.
Meanwhile, former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson had some glowing words for a single continental country.
Life expectancy in Africa has risen astonishingly as that country has entered the global economic system.
Sometimes the confusion went beyond borders altogether and introduced us to undiscovered and mysterious lands. While Poland's former foreign minister Witold Waszczykowski proclaimed a new South American banana republic.
San Escobar albo Belize.
After all, we're all citizens of the world. Be it San Escobar, the beautiful city of Belgium, or Kyrgyzstan. Here's to hoping we're far from wherever the midnight hammer falls.
Tune in for more on-air episodes every Saturday at 8:30 CET. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.